of double microphone situation. Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. If everyone can just make sure they turn off their mobile phones, that'd be fantastic. And Stephen will be taking questions after the talk as well. So perhaps, although we're normally quite informal at the Photographers Gallery, perhaps if you could keep your questions till the end, that'd be fantastic. So, as some of you will know, the Photographers Gallery has just started a very exciting year-long refurbishment program at our site on Ramillies Street. And when I asked Stephen quite a few months ago now if he was interested in coming to speak here as part of our series on photography and the built environment, I was extremely pleased that he said yes and would be kicking off our series of talks, events, seminars and lectures and various collaborations over a year with the Photographers Gallery's Talks Department. And this is our first in the series of talks in and around the Soho area. So tonight is just outside the Soho area. Stephen's work has been widely exhibited over the past 35 years, but I'm sure most of you will know his work probably mostly through his publications and his books, Uncommon Places, Essex County and American Surfaces, amongst others. Since 1982, he has been the director of the photography program at Bard College in upstate New York, where he is the Susan Weber Professor in Arts. So I'm going to hand straight over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna, and thanks to all of you for coming. A number of years ago, I was reading the American magazine, The New Republic, reading a review by their film critic, Stanley Kaufman. And this was the one time that Kaufman wrote about still photography instead of film. He had gone to a show of Alfred Stieglitz's photographs at Stieglitz's home in Lake George, New York. That was at the Museum of Modern Art, and he wrote how beautiful each of the pictures were and how impressed he was with the show. And then went on to say that that evening he went to a screening of Bergman's film Wild Strawberries, and that every shot in the film was as beautiful as a Stieglitz photograph, and Bergman had the advantage of working in a more complete medium. And when I read that, I realized that Kaufman didn't understand still photography, that still photography's meaning and poetry come from its incompleteness. A photograph can imply a narrative, but it never really is narrative. It can describe, but it explains very little. This picture here doesn't explain why this Victorian gentleman is sitting in a yard full of apples. To understand photography's limits, to understand its incompleteness, we need to understand how a three-dimensional world flowing in time is transformed into a static, flat photograph. There are four major factors of this transformation. They're flatness, the frame, time, and focus. First is flatness. The world is three-dimensional. It's simple. The world is three-dimensional. A photograph is flat. And not only is it flat, but it, except for the rare case of stereo cameras, it's seen with monocular vision. And when a three-dimensional image is projected through a single lens on a plane, relationships are created in space which don't exist in the real world. What I mean by that is, in this photograph, there is a very specific relationship between the cloud above the yield sign and the street sign. To say it didn't exist in the real world doesn't mean that the yield sign wasn't there and the cloud wasn't there, but this relationship of one touching the other wasn't there in the real world. It only exists in a photograph. And so any photographer confronting the three-dimensional world is thinking about how relationships between the foreground and the background will evolve. And to do this, you control the vantage point, the exact placement of the camera. And so here's one of mine, and again, you see relationships from the foreground to the background. This sign and that sign. The chevron sign and the lamppost behind it. So it's a very complex network of relationships are created by flatness. The second transformative factor is the frame. Photographers often think of the frame as the beginning of a picture. It's where the picture begins, not just some place that it has to end. It's the beginning of the structure of the picture. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that all the visual relationships contained in it all refer back to the frame. It's the beginning of the picture's geometry. The frame also creates relationships that don't exist in the world. By emphasis, by grouping things in a frame, it draws our attention to relationships. And a very slight movement of a frame can radically alter the meaning of a picture. So this is a picture by the photographer Robert Adams. And if you look carefully, in the lower right-hand corner, not that visible in the light in this room, but you can just make it out, is a railroad track. It would have been very easy for him to move the frame a little bit to the left and a little up and avoid the railroad track and have a picture of a forested hillside. But by including the railroad track, in fact, by including as little as possible and have it be recognizable, in a way emphasizing it by its own minimalness, he's making you think about a relationship between the railroad track and this hillside, and if you can read topography, you would realize that this is a hill that had been forested, that had been clear cut, except for the trees standing at the crown of the hill, and that the logs were taken away on that railroad track. So this slight movement of the frame radically alters the picture's meaning. The next transformative factor is time. And it appears in two primary ways in a picture. One is frozen time, where the flow of time appears to be stopped in mid-action. And here again, a new event is created. And by saying a new event, I don't mean that this steer and his handler are not there in front of the camera, but the steer's tongue meeting the handler's Stetson in perfect symmetry only existed for a 250th of a second. And it frozen like this for us to examine is a new moment in time. Or time can appear to be still. The last transformative factor, the last tool, formal tool of photography that photographers have to control in translating the three-dimensional dynamic world into the flat static photograph is focus. There's no plane of focus in the world, but a camera always imposes a plane of focus. And by imposing that plane of focus, prioritizes one plane over all others in a scene. Vermeer used a camera obscura as an aid in his painting. But being a painter, he didn't have to exactly represent what was on the ground glass of the camera obscura. And so while the camera obscura would only have one plane of focus, he wasn't bound by that. He could paint the drape in the foreground and the painter in midground and the girl and map in the background as though they all were on the plane of focus. But as a photographer, we can't do that. We have to decide one plane and prioritize it. So because there are these 4 different transformative factors, we have 4 different tools of selection. And they are focus, the moment we take the picture and the duration that the exposure lasts, the choice of the frame, and the choice of vantage point. And they define the image. Photography is inherently an analytic medium, where a painter starts with a blank canvas and every mark that she or he makes on the canvas makes it more complex. A photographer, and so painting is inherently synthetic, photography is the opposite. A photographer starts with the whole world and every decision brings order to it. To my mind, a photograph is solved more than it is composed. A photographer combines a perception of the world, a perception of photography, of art, a perception about themselves. A photographer combines a perception with an understanding of these transformations, essentially with an understanding of photography's limitations. In 1993, I was commissioned to photograph in the Italian town of Luzzara, in a small village in the Po Valley. This is the same village that Paul Strand had visited 40 years before and produced his book Un Paese. When I was preparing to go on this trip, an Italian historian of photography sent me a copy of a letter that Paul Strand had written while he was in Luzzara to a friend back in the States, in which Strand said it was very difficult to photograph there because, and I'm quoting Strand, there were no buildings of architectural interest. Here's my copy of Un Paese, which I've had since, I've had it for at least 40, 45 years. And I hadn't thought about it, but opened up the book and realized, in fact, there were very few photographs of architecture. And so I wondered about this phrase. What did Strand mean by architectural interest? Because clearly it meant something different to him than it did to me. So for Strand, here's a picture he did in the Outer Hebrides. It could be a simple handmade structure that expresses man's unity with the earth. Or it could be the stark spirituality of a New England church. For some photographers, architectural interest could be a significant work of architecture. Or it could be a monument of the ancient world. But there's another tradition in photography that goes back to photography's very origins. This is by Talbot. These photographers saw architecture as a visual manifestation of cultural forces. And a camera, obviously, can only deal with the visible. So what I'm saying is, if a photographer wants to explore these cultural forces, the means they have, the world presents to them for doing this is architecture and the built environment. This tradition stretches from Talbot to George Washington Wilson, to Thomas Annan, to Charles Marville, to Eugene Auger, who made this picture, and to Walker Evans, who made this photograph of the dining room in Belgrove Plantation. Evans was the subject of the first solo photography show at the Museum of Modern Art. The director of the photography department at the time was a man named Beaumont Newhall, and Newhall wrote a book called The History of Photography. In an early edition of that book, he had a chapter called Recent Trends, and he outlined 4 recent trends. And they were the document, the straight photograph, the formalist photograph, and the equivalent. So the document is a picture that essentially points at something in the world and says, look at this, this is worthy of your attention. The straight photograph is the self-conscious work of art, where the photographer is saying, look at this piece of paper with an image on it. This is worthy of your attention. The formalist photograph explores the structural qualities of an image or the formal nature of the medium. And the equivalent, he borrows a term here from Alfred Stieglitz, stands for or engenders a state of mind or an emotional state. And when I think about the photographs that mean the most to me, like this picture by Evans, it seems that these distinctions don't get to the point that a complex picture like this is all 4 of these trends, as Newhall called them, and that the pictures that mean most to me, in fact, are 2, 3, or all 4 of these. And on top of this, Evans, well, let me say that if one were to question, does Evans even think of this as an equivalent? The one time I saw Evans speak at the Museum of Modern Art in the early 70s, he showed a number of his pictures and spoke of them as being transcendent documents. And as I understand what he was saying, he was talking about the picture existing as a document and as an equivalent at the same time. And Evans adds something else to this mixture. He also spoke of his work in the 30s as being in documentary style. And what he meant by that, I take this to be that he was showing a postmodern understanding of how style draws meaning through its cultural reference. So the form the picture is taking, the kind of matter-of-factness, the flash is reminiscent of news photography of the time. By choosing this form, he's drawing meaning to it from the cultural reference of the form itself. I did something a little similar in the early 70s when I took a trip across America and produced the work from this series called American Surfaces as Kodak made snapshots. They sent the film off to my local corner photo store. They sent it to Kodak, and the prints were exhibited as little 3x5 snapshots. The next 12 images I'm going to show you were made as part of the series. Without caption or comment, a photographer can communicate the taste of an era through content, structure, and form. So I chose to show them as snapshots because that form would impart part of the taste, part of the savor of the time that I was trying to communicate. As snapshots, they were themselves cultural artifacts. For a 30-year period, John Charkowski was the director of the photography department at the Modern. And he wrote a very interesting piece about what a photographer does and about photography. He wrote many interesting pieces, but I'm going to read one of them. As a way of beginning, one might compare the art of photography to the act of pointing. All of us, even the best-mannered of us, occasionally point, and it must be true that some of us point to more interesting facts, events, circumstances, and configurations than others. It's not difficult to imagine a person who might elevate the act of pointing to a creative plane. A person who would lead us through the fields and streets and indicate a sequence of phenomena and aspects that would be beautiful, humorous, morally instructive, cleverly ordered, mysterious, or astonishing, once brought to our attention, but had been unseen before or seen dumbly without comprehension. This practitioner of the new discipline would perform with a special grace, sense of timing, narrative sweep, and wit, thus endowing the act not merely with intelligence, but with that quality of formal rigor that identifies a work of art, so that we would be uncertain when remembering the adventure of the tour how much of our pleasure and sense of enlargement came from the things pointed to and how much from a pattern created by the pointer. Charkowski goes on to say that what he just said was only a vague approximation because photographers really don't point. As I mentioned before, they frame. Now I'm going to show some work of mine. I'm going to start with some recent work. The first few images were made in Israel. It's from a large project that I've been involved in there. I've been there about 3 months since the past year working. And one of my interests is how land is built on. This is an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. This is a 6th century monastery in the middle of the Judean desert. A Druze village in the north. Take a look at this picture, and let me ask you to look at the foreground and move your attention along the ground without skipping over anything all the way to the horizon. And I'd like you to tell me if when you're doing this, you have the sensation of your eye changing focus. That as you move your attention from the foreground to the top of the hill, you actually feel your eye changing focus. Anyone? See, I find this very interesting because you're looking at a flat screen. And I'll tell you what I take this to mean. When we look at anything in the world, we are looking at a visual image in our minds. Our eyes work just like a digital camera. The lens of our eye focuses an upside down and backward image on a digital sensor array called the retina, which sends an electrical signal to the brain, which creates an image. All we ever see is a mental image. When you're looking at this picture, you're seeing a three-dimensional mental image because the picture is sending you clues, is sending your mind clues to build a three-dimensional mental image of it, not a flat mental image. And so the sensation of focus is the sensation of moving your attention through that three-dimensional space, that three-dimensional mental space. This picture shows Palestinian villages on the hilltops and a Bedouin camp in the valley. You may notice how the meaning of these pictures is altered by the verbal information I've been supplying to you. I think that realization goes to the heart of some of photography's limitations. This picture was made in Hebron. It's a guard post separating the Israeli settlement in Hebron from the Palestinian city. Now I'm going to show you some work of mine from the 1970s. These were made with, on a series of trips across North America. They were all made with view cameras. A photographer trying to communicate his or her perception of the currents below the surface of things has to find instances where these currents are visibly manifest. There's an old Arab saying, "The apparent is the bridge to the real." For many photographers, architecture serves this function. Architecture is the form in which many cultural forces find expression and become therefore accessible to a mute visual medium. Buildings express the physical constraints of their materials. A building made of curved I-beams and titanium can look different from one made of sandstone blocks. A building expresses the economic constraints of its construction. And a building expresses the aesthetic parameters of its builder and its culture. For better or for worse. This latter is the product of all the diverse elements that make up style. Traditions, aspirations, conditioning, imagination, posturings, perceptions. On a city street, a building is sited between others, built or renovated at different times and in different styles. And these buildings are next to still others. And this whole complex scene experiences the pressure of weather and time. The taste of the personality of society becomes accessible to a camera. In this picture, for example, I'm interested, well, on these trips I was making, I found I could explore both North American culture and explore photography at the same time. That the two were united. And so in terms of the transformations I talked about before, I'm thinking about the relationship of the lamppost on the right to the edge of the building, to the eave of the building, and how it appears on when flattened onto the picture plane. At the same time, I'm thinking about how this New England industrial town ends. Here, this street marks the end of the town, and the countryside begins. And I'm interested in this transition. So for a number of years, I was making these trips across the country. I was living in New York at the time and didn't own a car, and so I'd rent cars. And the rented cars in the early 70s didn't have tape decks in them. So I'd listen to a lot of top 40 radio, which eventually got very tiring. And I would amuse myself on these trips by reciting speeches from Shakespeare. And one of the speeches that meant the most to me was from Hamlet. Hamlet has brought a group of actors to his castle to put on his play. And he gives them an acting lesson. the acting lesson begins with a description of the relationship of form to content and ends with a description of meaning. He tells them, suit the action to the word and the word to the action with this special observance, that you overstep not the modesty of nature, for anything so overdone is away from the purpose of playing, whose purpose was and is first and last to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time is form and pressure. So I'd like to look at that a little closely. As I said, it begins with the relationship of form to content. Suit the action to the word and the word to the action. And what's implied there is that there's an integral relationship of form to content. That form is not simply a prettification of content. Form isn't art sauce that's poured over content, but that form and structure are ways of elucidating content, ways of bringing meaning to content. By analogy, the same way grammar brings meaning to sentences. I could string a few words together randomly, and you may get some little snippets of meaning from hearing those words. But for you to understand what I'm saying now is based on a mutual understanding and a common grammar. And this is the function that structure plays in a photograph. But then Shakespeare says, or Hamlet says, overstep not the modesty of nature, for anything so overdone is away from the purpose of playing. So that is a plea for what I would call transparency, that these structural decisions are not to call attention to themselves, but that you see through them almost transparently to the subject, so that an average viewer may not even realize what the artist has done or what the actor has done. Then Hamlet goes on to talk about meaning, to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature and scorn her own image. Well, this scorn and virtue seem to me more the province of literature and drama and film, and not still photography. But it's this last line of his, to show the very age and body of the time is form and pressure. That seems to present a goal that many photographers have striven for, to show the very age and body of the time is form and pressure. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Stephen. And I think now we're going to open it up to
I would be more than delighted to answer any question.
I've got a microphone here, and my colleague's got one there. We've got a slightly sort of apartheid situation where the architects are in this area and photography people in this area. So I don't know if we've got anybody. Well, while we're sort of taking that in, perhaps I'll ask a question, just so that people can things can sink in a little bit. It was just really about, it's quite a straightforward, basic one really. It's about the perspective shift between your American pictures. It feels like you're very much on the streets, you're at a low level, and then the ones more recently in Israel are very much more from a further away kind of distance. And just if that's something to do with the fact that you are so very much sort of embodied in those American pictures, and perhaps you're standing back further when you're looking at the
I'm standing back further in the ones I've shown you because I'm interested in the forms of the land.
Yeah.
And so I need to be back further to simply to show the land formation.
And is there anything to do with that in the fact that you're interested in the sort of political kind of situation? Well, of course you are in the American pictures as well, but perhaps from a different perspective, from being within them, being when you were taking those pictures, you were so very much embodied in them somehow at that time in America.
Behind both of your questions is the implication that I'm more involved in the pictures in America, and I don't think that's the case. In terms of, since you used the word political, and working in Israel is very interesting because politics is on people's minds all the time there. But in working there, I found I came really head to head with photography's limitations. Think about, as I mentioned when I showed you these pictures, how much information you got from a simple sentence that I attached to each of the images. And then I showed one that I didn't say anything about. And you may not have understood really what that picture was about. Who sprayed, painted those Magen Davids on the doors? What did it mean? Can a photograph explain what it means? I don't think it can. And so I think there is a complexity of the political situation there that could be hinted at in photographs, and that if someone is familiar with the country, could read into photographs, and could read when you could learn to recognize the difference between an Arab in the West Bank, an Arab village, and an Israeli settlement, because the Israeli settlements usually have orange roofs, and the Arab villages all have black water tanks on them. Otherwise, it's hard to distinguish. But if you knew this, you could distinguish it. But an audience in England wouldn't have any way of knowing that. There's just so much that can be said so simply in one sentence that can't be addressed at all in photography. And what I hoped I brought across tonight was that photography, I agree with, partially with Stanley Kaufman, that photography is limited. But this is the world that we photographers have chosen to live in and use its limitations. And part of the understanding of the limitations is an understanding of what we can't deal with. We can show things, however, describe things in a way words cannot possibly describe. For example, I guess we turned off this projector. Okay. You can describe, you can go from edge to edge in a picture and put into words a description of everything you see, and that description might take 5 minutes to read. You lose the simultaneity of experience. And to see that the Israeli settlement in front of the vineyard and see it in the hillside in that light, gleaming in the light all at one time, you can't get that experience of simultaneity, of the simultaneity of relationships in words. Because simply it's a linear medium, words are, and it takes time to work through them. So photographs describe in a way words cannot possibly describe. Words have limitations too.
So can you say something a little bit more about the seriality or producing things in a big series in your work? I mean, in that regard, I mean, you've talked brilliantly about how a single image will work, and then you show us a series, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it means for whether it's forms or content, or how it is that that works through a large group of images.
One of the joys of photography is that a photographer can deal with many problems in one day, many problems in one picture, and many pictures, and therefore many, many problems in one day. And some projects, both mine and other people's, depend on seeing the work in sequence or in a group. Others are made with different intents, and the pictures are meant to stand alone. I'm just finishing with Amanda editing a book where everything is made to be seen in sequence, and it changes the nature of the individual image because the image doesn't have to stand alone, and the work is the sequence. And the complexity of the work is the variety, or is the range and focus of the works within the sequence. This takes a certain kind of pressure off the individual picture, and the picture, it frees it to be more notational, a quicker observation. So I find I work in both ways, and sometimes we'll take individual works but still group them in a sequence, but they're made, but that is a sequence of freestanding works, which I think on Common Places is, for example. I'm not sure that answers your question, Simon.
Hi. Is this working? I read somewhere, I don't know how accurate this is, Stephen, but I read somewhere that recently that Gary Winogrand had made a quote stating that the most successful photographs are on the edge of failure. And I think he was talking about the relationship between form and content, but I'm not sure. I wonder if you could illuminate that for us.
I can. Maybe. One of the things that I find, I've been teaching for a long time, and one of the things I find it difficult to explain to students is the difference between a picture that's an illustration and a picture that's a photograph. And so I occasionally ask people I meet how they would define it. And I once asked Sharkowski, and he said an illustration is a picture whose problems were solved before the picture was made. So if you see a photograph, just as I talked about relationships being created in a picture that didn't exist in the world, and so they only come together, they don't even come together in your eye, literally, they come together in a photographer's understanding of how what they're seeing is going to be translated. So there's this new relationship created in the photograph. In the same way, there are problems to be solved by a picture that are solved in the actual making of the photograph. And I think that relates to what Winogrand is saying. I know I can speak for myself and say that when I'm involved in a project and questions stop arising, and I find myself repeating myself. I lose total interest in the project and will go in a completely new direction in my work because there are no more problems to solve there along that avenue.
Thank you.
By extension, then, would creativity in photography be the solving of problems that you didn't know existed?
Well, you know they exist when you're working on them. I mean, what I find often happens is, let's say during the period of Uncommon Places, a series of problems arose, and they would arise on their own. It's not like I'm sitting in my loft in New York thinking of what problem will I solve next. This would become a question on my mind. And let me add that I'm convinced that most good art is produced for this reason, not to produce good art. I don't think artists decide, I'm going to make some good art today. Maybe some do. But then it's probably not that good. I think most artists have these issues that are in their minds that they can't get out of their head, and the way they deal with it is to produce the art. And so as I would solve or deal with one or two or three questions or whatever I was dealing with at the time, new questions almost by themselves would arise, and this propelled the work forward. There have been other times where I've had specific issues on my mind. And so there came a time around 1980 where I found I was beginning to repeat myself with Uncommon Places work. That I would go to a village, I'd go to a town, go to a city, and I would know exactly where to stand. And I know exactly how to make two-dimensional sense of three-dimensional space. It became easy and had no interest. But there was one problem that I had been working on for years that I felt was unsolved, and that was, why is it that some photographs that I see have a convincing illusion of three-dimensional space? And for years I tried to deal with it in structural terms. What happens if I use one-point perspective? What happens if I have the edge of a road go exactly into the corner of the picture, or a hair above the corner of the picture? What if there's a car just jutting in from the frame to establish a picture plane? What if I have telephone poles in close tension to the frame of the picture? Trying to use these structural means of figuring out how this was created, how this sense of three-dimensional space was created. And this relates to the picture I showed you, where I asked you to focus through the space of the picture, because I found myself for various reasons living in Montana and would go out into the high meadows there, and there were no roads to offer one-point perspective and no telephone poles. And I was just out on this open land. And the question then arose, can I do it here? There's some other, I can see it. I can stand here and be acutely aware of myself in this vast space, maybe more acutely aware than in a city, but without any means for structural articulation available. Can this be represented in a photograph? And it took me about 10 years to figure it out. Which is, if you think about that picture I showed you, there is a road in the foreground that has some perspectival impact. But I think basically what's operating in that picture is not that.
Two more questions here and one there. Anybody else who's got questions? Can you raise your hand and we'll have it up to the So we'll just go one down here.
You were saying about everybody's pointing at something, and you said photographers are framing things.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you're always, and the picture on the screen was actually a picture of a table with some magazines on it. And I wondered whether you were pointing, or whether you were looking and pointing, or and framing, or whether you were arranging and then framing and pointing.
What picture are you referring to?
It was a table with a lamp and
Oh.
2 magazines or something. I mean, not particularly this
Yeah.
one picture, but in general.
Okay. Am I arranging what I'm...
Are you arranging, or are you always looking and
no,
finding?
sometimes I'm arranging.
Right.
I wasn't in that picture, but there's something so arbitrary in a way about the decisions a photographer makes. And I think a good example is the Robert Adams picture I showed of the hillside and the train track, where he can go like this, and the meaning of the picture changes immensely. And he goes like that, and it's a totally different picture. It's so easy for this to be in a photographer's control that I don't see where arranging something on a tabletop makes any difference. And I don't do that, but I've driven my car into pictures. If the picture needs a car, I'll put it in, and then I'll look in the camera and say, oh no, it really needs to be a couple of feet back, so I'll get back in the car and back it up a little bit. And that seems minor, but yes. And I want to give a slight clarification to what I was saying earlier during the talk about photography being analytic. It is an analytic view, but it can be of a synthetic subject. For example, there's a photographer, Gregory Crutzen, and in Crutzen's early work, he was building dioramas on tabletops. He had this huge table in his studio, and he would build these dioramas with a pond and huge insects and suburban houses in the background, filling this large tabletop with this. So he was building an entirely synthesized world, but then he'd get behind the camera and move around it and make totally analytic photographic decisions. Well, the reason I'm mentioning his work is because if he knew in advance how the picture was going to turn out, he wouldn't need to build a rectangular diorama. All he would need to build is a triangle, following the line of sight of the camera. But he didn't, because he's inherently a photographer, fabricating this world, but then moving around it, making the same analytic decisions that I make walking through a town.
Hi.
Go.
You've spoken tonight about how you frame a picture and the relations of putting things into a two-dimensional space, like with the street signs, etc. But you've also spoken before about how the view camera, so the amount of time it would take you to look at a scene with your eyes in the same detail that you get from your view camera is, half an hour, 45 minutes. I also know, looking through the ground glass of a view camera, you're not going to be able to see everything that you're going to see in the final print on your ground glass. I was wondering, how often have you found, when you've got pictures back, that you find things in them that you hadn't necessarily intended to be there, but which make the photograph perfect? Like I think the picture that made me think of it today was there's one with contrails of aeroplanes which just go along exactly the same line as the wires in the street.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when you were taking it, did you see the contrails?
Yeah.
Or did you? Yeah. But how often do you ever find, when you get back, that you get a picture and you suddenly go, this is so much better than I thought because there's a boy's face at the window?
Actually, not that often.
No.
First of all, you said, and it's true, that you can't see everything on the ground glass. But the photograph isn't, most photographers who use view cameras don't make their decisions really looking at the ground glass. It's all looking at the world. And it's only the final decisions of exact framing that are made on the ground glass. So when I'm looking at that scene, the camera's next to me and I'm just looking at it. And I'm deciding without it. Often I would leave my car and leave coins on the ground where I'm just going to go take pictures in the scene. And I'm just walking around saying, okay, here's a picture, and put a coin down. Okay, here's another picture. So all these decisions are made just with my eyes. So it's not, because, yeah, looking through a camera, you really wouldn't see that much.
Sorry, my question is also to do with framing. It's getting a bit repetitive. But, I was interested when you were talking about framing and pointing in relation to which camera you're using. You said you used the view camera and also the Kodak snapshot one. And you also showed an image of the steer licking the handler's hat. And I don't know, I think that's probably an image that you wouldn't necessarily capture with the view camera. And I was wondering...
They couldn't
No,
possibly capture
couldn't, but you'd have to maybe wait a long time for it. And I was thinking maybe whether your use of the Kodak snapshot camera was through a frustration at missing some of these fleeting moments. And when you change, I mean, I'm not sure, but it was maybe the only instance that you showed of using the snapshot camera, whether that was a conscious decision to move back to the view camera.
Well, first of all, let me start at the last part. It was a conscious decision to move to the view camera. The use of the snapshot camera was not about getting things I couldn't get with the view camera, because I, at that point, hadn't even used a view camera. So I wasn't feeling any limitation of the view camera. And if you think of all the pictures that I showed you with the snapshot camera, there were very few of them, if any, that couldn't have been taken with the view camera. And that I took pictures quite similar to them the following year with the view camera. I mean, there was nothing that I showed you that was actually stopping, that was freezing time. All of those pictures could have been made with the view camera. The project was much larger, and there were pictures in the project which, in fact, couldn't have been made with a view camera. But it wasn't. It was because I wanted to make snapshots. I wanted to make little, brightly colored, glossy snapshots that I went through that process, not because of something I couldn't do with a view camera. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I wondered if you had any like sort of views or experiences of how it's been sort of working with the medium of photography and its kind of status in, which I think is maybe slightly different in American institutions to maybe like European, and speaking, you know, from your experience and that how it's been sort of working with photography as a medium and maybe related to the art world and institutions and its kind of place in all of that kind of thing.
Well, it's changed a lot in the time I've been working. And I think it's changed for both better and worse. And I would say the dangers were that, well, for example, when I stopped, around 1980, I stopped the series Uncommon Places for the reasons I gave, that I saw myself beginning to repeat myself and I lost interest in it. When I did that, two of my dealers dropped me. Now, when you're selling pictures for $200 a piece, it's not the end of the world. And so I can say, look, it doesn't matter to me if they don't show my work anymore. I'm doing what I'm interested in. And I see my students today, some of them making decisions about how they're going to proceed on their art based on the market, which maybe I'm being too idealistic, but I don't think this is the way you make these decisions. And I think in time, over the long period of time, the decisions made for that reason are going to be filtered out. So there was a kind of wonderful purity to the photography world 40 years ago because there was no money involved and there was no fame involved. And you did it because you wanted to do it. The good side, however, I'm not saying this is all bad. The good side is I can make a living at it now, and that's important. So which would I rather have? I rather have it today. But it takes a certain kind of stamina and to say, I don't care if my last show was successful. I have new interests. I have new questions in my mind. I'm going and following them.
Hi. I was interested in your idea that a photographer chooses the incompleteness of its medium to explore. And I wanted to ask if you think that the camera, that is the instrument of the medium, becomes also a mediator between the photographer's inner self and the immediate environment, and therefore maybe the work of a photographer, as much as it can be analytical in its descriptions and descriptiveness, as much it is also descriptive of its author and maybe psychoanalytical in that sense?
Are you asking, is it also the imprint of the camera?
Yeah, that not only the image of the surrounding of the actual world around the photographer is portrayed, but also the inner world of a photographer in its view in the completeness of the photographer's work.
I'm still not sure I understand your question. What does that have to do with the choice of the camera?
No, the camera becomes then not only like a tool to recreate reality, but a mediator between one's inner self and its environment.
Yes.
So you don't not only match
Yes.
the world on the screen, but also some...
Yes, and I think where this comes into play is what I've referred to a couple of times about using the sense of three-dimensional space as an example. And I'm talking about three-dimensional space because it's the most matter-of-fact example. But what it essentially is saying is that there are subtle qualities of a photographer's perception that are communicated in a photograph. And I'm convinced that that a photographer who has had experience with the medium, I'm not saying someone who's never picked up a camera before, but someone who's had a lot of experience and who essentially mastered the formal tools and the mechanical tools of the medium, that the perceptual aspects of their state of mind can be impressed upon a photograph. Is that addressing what you're saying? And I've talked about specifically the perception of three-dimensional space because it seems the most matter-of-fact to talk about, but behind that is an implication that there are much larger and deeper issues that can be communicated in the same way.
Okay. Hi. I'd like to perhaps ask a question sort of standing back, and I'll be very interested in hear what you think about looking back over your career and from those initial road trips that you undertook, which certainly in my mind kind of have become very important in the evolution of the history of photography, from the point at which you took off at the early part of your career, which was when I was studying photography sort of almost 30 years ago, to how photography has evolved over the period of time to where we are today. I referenced an exhibition, I think, in Brighton and particularly in the Delaware Pavilion, which captures some of the work that was done earlier on in the century, some of the work I think that you may have on display, or certainly of photographers who were working around that time. And also the way that contemporary photography, in particular I'm thinking of the Becker School, has evolved, and how the connections have been made to your work and some of the other photographers, Walker Evans, William Eggleston perhaps, and just generally your view on the world of photography as it's changed over this period of time, sort of 30, 40 years.
In the world of photography, in terms of what photographers are doing?
Well, in terms of the creative world of photography, I mean, it's obviously changed enormously since when you went out on the road trips and the fact that photography wasn't such a broad medium in terms of the people who were taking pictures as it is today, for instance. But also that there's been a clear, I think, a clear strand of a type of photography or capturing the environment or archiving of our world that we live in, and with this particular kind of vision that's evolved that can be connected into what you were doing, certainly what people have done before you, and the thread as it's evolved. And I'm interested to meet, to be able to talk to somebody who can perhaps have a vision over that spectrum.
I'm not sure if this exactly answers your question, but let me try. It seemed to me that apprenticeship is a useful and important way of learning a discipline, but that photography, as it was practiced by artists, didn't lend itself to that, because it was until recently artist photographers didn't have studios, didn't have assistants, and so an apprentice would only be in my way, or I would be if I wanted to be Walker Evans' apprentice, I would be in his way. So that opportunity didn't present itself. But what I realized was that you can apprentice yourself to a tradition. And there is a tradition that ran through photography that I in 5 slides, quickly ran through, from Talbot to Marville to Auger to Evans, that had that expressed both an interest in the world and an interest in exploring the medium, the formal qualities of the medium at the same time. And I feel that to some extent, there have been other influences on me, like the time I spent with Andy Warhol, and also my exposure to the work of Ed Ruscha, and to different painters and composers, and lots of influences anyone would have in experiencing modern cultural life. But within that, there was this strain of an apprenticeship to a tradition, and I think that continues. And there are other people, some of whom you've mentioned, who have continued in that line.
It just leaves to say thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.